America's double standards and the justification of war. 1. The fundamental difference between the USS Maine incident and the attack on Pearl Harbor. The USS Maine incident in 1898 involved the explosion and sinking of the U.S. Navy battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. Although the cause of the explosion remained unclear, the United States blamed Spain and used it as a pretext to start the Spanish-American War. Since this war lacked a legitimate casus belli under international law, it cannot be considered a justified war. On the other hand, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was a result of an economic blockade, ABCD encirclement, and diplomatic pressure, Hull note, which made war unavoidable. Unlike the USS Maine incident, the United States itself created the conditions that led to war. Conclusion. The USS Maine incident represents a war that did not need to happen but was initiated by the US, raising serious legal concerns. In contrast, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a military response to economic warfare and cannot simply be labeled as an act of aggression. 2. The justification of war from an international law perspective. The legitimacy of war should not be judged solely by who attacked first, but by the factors that made war inevitable. International law evaluates war not just based on preemptive attacks, but also by considering the circumstances leading to war and the presence of diplomatic negotiations. Article 51 of the UN Charter recognizes the right to self-defense only when an armed attack occurs. However, economic blockades and extreme diplomatic pressure can create situations where war becomes the only option, making legal judgments more complex. Japan could have argued self-defense under international law. The Hull note demanded that Japan withdraw from China and French Indochina, threatening continued economic sanctions if they refused. This posed an existential threat to Japan, making war unavoidable. Although Japan had a legal basis to argue for self-defense, the international community did not recognize this claim. Conclusion. The USS Maine incident was a war without legitimate justification, raising suspicions of legal violations. Meanwhile, Japan's reasoning for the attack on Pearl Harbor had some legitimacy due to extreme diplomatic pressure, even though it was not formally recognized under international law. 3. Why the Pearl Harbor attack was not considered a major violation. The 1907 Hague Conventions required formal declarations of war, but their applicability to naval warfare was unclear. While these rules mandated clear notifications or an ultimatum before initiating war, they primarily applied to land warfare. Japan interpreted that pre-announcement was not required for naval operations. Additionally, surprise attacks in naval warfare were not uncommon. In the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, Japan attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before officially declaring war, yet this was not considered a violation of international law. Similarly, in the Anglo-German War, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany and immediately launched naval operations, demonstrating that pre-war military actions were common. At that time, there was no unified international standard for declaring war. Thus, the delay in Japan's war declaration was not considered a major international law violation. Even during the post-war Tokyo trials, Japan's delay in declaring war was not prosecuted as a war crime, indicating that even the victorious powers found it difficult to argue that Japan's attack was legally criminal. Conclusion. While the delay in Japan's declaration of war was criticized diplomatically and morally, it was not classified as a serious violation of international law. 4. America's double standards. The U.S. condemns the Pearl Harbor attack as a sneak attack while justifying similar actions in its own wars, revealing a clear double standard. The U.S. itself has engaged in wars without prior declaration, such as the Mexican War, the Philippine-American War, the Iraq War, 2003. Moreover, pre-war military actions were common in the Russo-Japanese War, the Anglo-German War, the Spanish-American War. The fact that Japan's delayed war declaration was not prosecuted as a war crime further proves that it was not considered a serious violation of international law. Conclusion. The perception of the Pearl Harbor attack as a sneak attack was largely shaped by American propaganda rather than international law. War should be judged by consistent legal standards, not by the victor's narrative. 5. War should be evaluated based on international law, not the victor's perspective. History is often written by the victors, but a fair assessment must be based on international law. Instead of focusing solely on who attacked first, it is crucial to examine why war became inevitable and whether war could have been avoided. The 1974 UN Resolution 33114 definition of aggression states that aggression should not be judged solely by preemptive attacks, but also by the factors that made war unavoidable. Economic blockades and diplomatic pressure that force a country into war must be considered when evaluating the justification of military actions. Even in evaluating the Pearl Harbor attack, one must consider not just Japan's actions, but also whether the U.S. left Japan with any alternative to war. Conclusion: a fair assessment of war must be based on legal and diplomatic realities, not the victor's propaganda. 6. America's double standards and the need for historical reassessment. Comparing the USS Maine incident with the Pearl Harbor attack, as well as reviewing past American military actions, reveals that the U.S. has not applied a consistent standard when evaluating wars. The U.S. legitimizes its own wars while condemning Japan's military actions as aggression, or sneak attacks, exposing clear contradictions. 1. The U.S. has justified wars without prior declarations while condemning Japan for the same. 2. The USS Maine incident, the Philippine-American War, and the Iraq War were all launched without clear casus belli, yet the U.S. continues to portray the Pearl Harbor attack as uniquely treacherous. 3. The U.S. ignores diplomatic pressure in its own wars, but fails to consider Japan's situation before Pearl Harbor. 4. The inevitability of war is often ignored in historical evaluations. Conclusion: war should be evaluated not by the victor's perspective, but by consistent legal principles. 7. Conclusion: questioning America's double standards in war justifications. When evaluating wars, the key question should be why war happened, not just who attacked first. Under international law, Japan's delay in declaring war was not classified as a serious violation. Final proposals: America's war justifications must follow consistent legal principles. War assessments must consider diplomatic pressures and the inevitability of conflict. Historical narratives should avoid oversimplifications and incorporate international legal perspectives. Recognizing America's double standards is necessary for a fair reassessment of history.